Good day. Today is Friday, 22nd August 2025, and as you can see, I'm not in my usual place, my library. I've had to relocate because there's building works and other works being carried out, and the noise levels are very high, though they're not continuous, and the result is I'm back in my other room where there is the picture of the horse behind me. Now, I hope that we don't get many noises or interruptions over the course of this program. If we do, well, there it is. I don't work, as you realise, from a studio, and I can't insulate myself completely from ambient noise. Anyway, let's press forward with our program. And today, Friday, 22nd August 2025, we have had the first thing I want to talk about is a very strange, rather confusing, rather ambiguous truth social post by the President of the United States, Donald Trump. And I'm going to read it out and then I'm going to try and pass it, though doing so, to be honest, is quite a challenge, and it's perhaps an unusually difficult post to try to understand, and its purpose is also extremely difficult to understand. Anyway, this is what this post says. As I said, it's on Truth Social, and it is by the President of the United States. It is by Donald Trump, and this is what he said. It is very hard, if not impossible, to win a war without attacking an invader's country. It's like a great team in sports that has a fantastic defense but is not allowed to play offense. There is no chance of winning. It is like that with Ukraine and Russia. Crooked and grossly incompetent Joe Biden would not let Ukraine fight back. The words fight back are capitalized. Only defend, also capitalized. How did that work out? ? Regardless, this is a war that would have never happened, never again capitalized, if I were president. Zero chance, and again capitalized once more. Interesting times ahead, ! President DJT. Now, a lot of people are commenting about how these words might imply a threat by Donald Trump against President Putin and against the Russians. The logic of this is that President Trump is disappointed by the various comments that coming out of Moscow, the ones I have discussed already, the ones in which the Russians make clear that they are not prepared to accept the kind of security guarantees that have been discussed in the West, security guarantees that would allow the deployment of European troops in Ukraine, NATO troops in Ukraine, security guarantees of an Article 5 character that would convert the United States and the NATO powers into allies, de facto allies of Ukraine. Security guarantees which would in effect contradict the entire rationale of the special military operation. And it's possible that this is true. It's possible that President Trump, reading or hearing the various comments that Foreign Minister Lavrov has been making, which has been the topic of my previous 3 videos, now understands that the Russians are not prepared to give the kind of security guarantees that all of those people in the United States, in Europe, in Ukraine have been talking about, and which we've been reading so much about in the various media outlets. He might also perhaps be annoyed by the fact that the Russians are far less keen on the Putin-Zelensky summit idea than he perhaps thought, and certainly the idea of a bilateral summit meeting coming up within a few days between Putin and Zelensky, to be followed by a trilateral meeting between Putin, Zelensky and Trump, well, I won't say that it's been kicked into the long grass, but the Russians have made it fairly clear that that is not on their agenda at the present time. President Trump, of course, had given a completely different impression. So it could be that he is indeed annoyed with the Russians about that. There's also the possibility that he is annoyed with the fact that the Russians attacked and destroyed, apparently, mostly destroyed, a factory in the Odessa region in Ukraine, which is producing electronics and which American business interests either owned outright or in which they had an interest. And it could be that that is something that annoyed Trump as well. And it could be, as most people are interpreting, that these words of Donald Trump's actually are some kind of a threat to the Russians, and that he is indeed preparing to give the Ukrainians the green light to launch strikes into Russia, deep strikes into Russia, something which, as he correctly says, the Biden administration for a certain time appeared to oppose, though it is worth saying that over the course of the last year of the Biden administration, 2024 to be precise, the Biden administration walked all that back. They stepped aside as Ukraine launched drone attacks deep into Russia. And of course, eventually, they supplied Ukraine with Toughens missiles and gave the green light for Ukraine to use Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles to conduct attacks on pre-1991 Russian territory also. So it could be that this is indeed what Donald Trump is saying. Now, I'm going to return to all of these topics and to the fact that it looks as if this is indeed what Donald Trump is saying, then he has completely misunderstood the Russian position and doesn't appear to understand that the Russians are very serious about the special military operation. A point, by the way, that Larry Johnson has made on his blog, Sonar 21, invaluable blog, by the way. But before I do that, I would make one further point about this message, this post that Trump has published on Truth Social, because there is an alternative explanation, which is that he's saying that if Ukraine is permanently on the defensive, as in effect it is, it cannot really attack Russia. It's made many attempts to do so with drones and missiles. It launched the big incursion into Kursk region, as we know, last year, which ended in a complete disaster. But it cannot really conduct an offensive war against Russia. Then, as Donald Trump says, there is no chance of winning. It is like that with Ukraine and Russia. And he said that crooked and grossly incompetent Joe Biden would not let Ukraine fight back, only defend. And how did that work out? Well, is that not perhaps a way of saying that Ukraine cannot win the war, that it cannot attack, that Biden never let it attack, that the ability of Ukraine to attack is gone, and the result is that unless there is a peace, unless there is a negotiated peace, Ukraine is going to lose. It seems to me that one possible interpretation of Trump's words is that one. Now, there is a third possibility, which is that Trump is trying to say both things at the same time. And that would not surprise me, by the way, that he's both trying to threaten and frighten the Russians, and he's also telling it to the Ukrainians as it is. He's telling the Russians, look, if you don't move forward and start taking more positive steps towards some kind of peace in Ukraine, if you don't relax your demands or water down your demands in the way that I want, well, I'm going to give the green light to allow the Ukrainians to launch more aggressive strikes against your energy complex in particular. And if that happens and energy prices rise, global energy prices rise, well, so be it. It could be that that is one message that Trump is indeed trying to give, and it could be simultaneously that he's giving the Ukrainians the other message. You cannot win. You can't take the offensive against the Russians. Joe Biden didn't let you. He was absolutely crazy to let you go to war in the first place, given that he was not going to allow you to launch offensive strikes against the Russians. And by the way, you're not really capable of launching offensive strikes against the Russians now either. So you've been complaining to me about the fact that I talk to the Russians. You have also been making unreasonable demands and taking unreasonable positions. What you need to do is to start to be more realistic about your prospects and to make peace. Now, I have to say that Trump is a complex man. I don't think he is the straightforward, almost cartoon strip character that people imagine him to be. And I think that he is capable of writing a message of this kind, ambiguous in its wording, signalling messages to both sides at the same time, and of course making in the process this post so difficult to understand. But anyway, I just want to throw that in. I think it is likely that we are going to see attacks by Ukraine deep inside Russia over the next couple of weeks. I think they will mostly target the Russian energy system, and I will discuss those in a moment. But I think that Trump is also basically hinting to the Ukrainians, look, if this isn't going to work, because you can't seriously attack the Russians, you have to face the fact that you're going to lose. And that means that you're going to have to make significant concessions, including much bigger territorial concessions than the ones you appear to be willing to agree to up to now. Anyway, that's what Trump has been saying. Now, let's return to that point that I made earlier, that perhaps Trump didn't fully understand, as Larry Johnson is saying, all of the points that the Russians have labored at various times to make to him. That no, they are not going to agree to security guarantees being provided by the Western powers to Ukraine. No, they are not going to agree to NATO forces being deployed on NATO territory. All of that is completely out of the question. Their basis for negotiation remains the Istanbul Agreement and the security guarantees, the very different security guarantees that were detailed there. And in addition, Ukraine will have to accept significant reductions in the size of its armed forces. And as Lavrov was explaining yesterday, and by the way, I should quickly say that I've now read the Russian Foreign Minister's transcript of Lavrov's words in the news conference, the press conference with the Indian Foreign Minister, Mr. Jaishankar. And it's basically the same. He made the same points about security guarantees as he made in the previous press conference, which he held with the Jordanian Foreign Minister, though it's perhaps true that the comments, Lavrov's comments over the course of the press conference with Jaishankar were even more forthright than the previous comments made in the earlier press conference with the Jordanian foreign minister. Anyway, returning to all of this, the Russians are never going to change their position about all of this. They've explained it all many, many times. They've tried to explain it to Trump. And if he did indeed misunderstand them, if he did indeed misunderstand Putin's words about security guarantees and thought that Putin was agreeing to Western-style security guarantees as opposed to the security guarantees that the Russians and the Ukrainians negotiated between them in 2022, then that unfortunately takes me back to an earlier point that I made in an earlier program, a program made before the Trump-Putin meeting took place in Alaska, that despite the fact that there's clearly been back channels between the Russians and the Americans, despite the fact that the Americans and the Russians have been talking to each other, the meeting in Alaska had all the hallmarks of having been arranged in haste, that there'd not been the proper preparation in advance of that meeting, that a meeting at this level, this kind of level, requires, and that probably explains why Trump went into the meeting without fully understanding the Russian position and came out of the meeting still not having fully understood the Russian position, despite Putin's attempts to spell it out to him. If there'd been the more orthodox setup for having a summit meeting, one in which the summit meeting is prepared over 6 weeks or a month, where there are meetings between officials, where the agenda of the meeting is clearly sorted out, where the two sides exchange documents in advance and explain clearly to the other what the underlying position they're going to start with at the summit meeting actually is. Well, if the meeting had been prepared in that way, then it's likely that misunderstandings like the ones that Trump may have come away with from the meeting would have been avoided. If you have a meeting like this set up in such a hurry, then I'm sorry to say it, misunderstandings are unsurprising and perhaps unavoidable. And I suspect that just as Trump may have misunderstood the Russian position on the special military operation, the terms of ending it, the Russian position on security guarantees, the Russian position on meetings between Putin and Zelensky, I think the Russians also perhaps read more into Trump's comments about looking at the security situation in Europe than Trump intended. As I discussed previously, the interview that Lavrov gave to the Russian media a couple of days ago suggested that the Russians believe that Trump and Rubio and Witkoff had agreed to a wider conversation between Russia and the United States about the security architecture of Europe. And frankly, I have seen no hint of that from the American side, and I don't believe it was the case. If I am right in what I've just said, that there are misunderstandings on each side, that each side believed that the other had moved closer to their position than was actually the case, then I'm afraid this meeting in Alaska would be a textbook example of why meetings arranged in haste between superpower leaders have a habit of ending in disappointment. I would say that there was another example of this that I remember very well, and this is the first meeting between President Gorbachev of the Soviet Union. He wasn't actually president, as I remember at that time. I think he was still just Secretary General of the Soviet Communist Party. And President Reagan of the United States in Geneva in 1986. The meeting again was arranged in haste. The Russians, the Soviets believed, Gorbachev believed, and he was, by the way, the person who'd pushed hard for that meeting. The Russians believed that they would come to the meeting and reach a clear understanding with the Americans on security issues, on nuclear weapons issues. Instead, the meeting became little more than a fireside chat, and it's not widely known, but Gorbachev came away from the meeting deeply disappointed by the way the meeting had gone. So there it is. Meetings like this have to be arranged carefully in advance. You could argue that the first meeting that Trump had with the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, in his first administration, followed that pattern also. Meetings like this really do need to be prepared properly. If they're not prepared properly, there is inevitably going to be disappointment. Trump may be expressing certain signs of disappointment in his Truth Social post. I suspect the Russians are going to be disappointed as well when they discover that Donald Trump has no intention, and I really don't believe he has any intention, of discussing at the present time the wider, bigger security architecture in Europe. His only objective is to bring the fighting in Ukraine to an end as quickly as possible so that he can stop this bleeding away of American resources, take the topic of sanctions against Russia and its trading partners off the table, focus on some kind of fence mending discussions with the Chinese about trade, and focus on the Middle East and the East Asian situation and the domestic problems in the United States as well. And of course, if he can walk away with a Nobel Peace Prize, well, I'm not suggesting that's his primary motivation, but obviously he won't be unhappy. I don't think, as I said, discussing NATO, the security architecture in Europe with the Russians is a thought which has ever actually even so much as occurred to him. And if the Russians believe that it has, then I'm afraid they're in for a very big disappointment. So anyway, that's what I think about this Truth Social post. That's what I think about the setting up of the meeting in Anchorage. Despite what I have said, it still seems to me that the meeting in Anchorage was a step forward. And the reason I still think that is because Trump did agree to the Russian demand, the Russian insistence, that the whole topic of a ceasefire be taken off the table. That was a concrete agreement reached by the Americans and the Russians in Anchorage. And that means that if there is going to be a negotiated resolution of the war, then that negotiated resolution has to be along the lines that the Russians have set out through discussions, negotiations between the Ukrainians and the Russians, and perhaps ultimately between the Russians and the Americans in the Istanbul format, where there already have been 3 meetings between the Russians and the Ukrainians which have taken place. And perhaps eventually, if this process of negotiation bears fruit, then there might be a meeting between Putin and Zelensky in their capacity as chief negotiators, acting on behalf of each of their countries. I should say that in the press conference with Jaishankar, Lavrov again put beyond doubt the Russian concerns about Zelensky's legal and constitutional status remain fully in effect. The Russians haven't pulled back from that at all. So something was achieved in Anchorage, and that was that the agreement that there would be no ceasefire, and that has broken the deadlock. It has taken the topic away from endless discussion about ceasefire, sterile discussions about a ceasefire that the Russians were never going to agree to. And that has set the scene for a proper negotiation process that might eventually, as the situation on the ground evolves, that might eventually take place. Well, let's now turn back to the first interpretation of Trump's True Social post, that he does expect the Ukrainians to launch some kind of offensive against the Russians. And, well, it does look as if the Ukrainians did have this plan to launch an offensive, a missile offensive against the Russians. And it appeared to be based around two missile systems. One was the Sapsan ballistic missile, which was a medium-range or short-range missile, which would have perhaps just about had the range to strike targets in Moscow, but it was apparently intended to be a Ukrainian equivalent of the Russian Iskander missile, though there's many commentators who doubt that it really is up to the level of an Iskander, and which would have presumably been used by the Ukrainians to strike targets in the rear and the rear in depth of the Russians. Perhaps it would have been mostly used to target Russian air defense systems. And the other missile, about which we've been hearing a great deal at the moment, is the Flamingo cruise missile system. Now, there's been an awful lot discussed about this over the last couple of days. The Ukrainians showed us a picture of this system a few days ago. I said that to me, with my inexpert eyes, it looked a little bit like a German World War II era V1 cruise missile. And I said that I expected that it could not be quite that. But we've learned a little bit more about this missile since then. And it is indeed a cruise missile. And apparently it is enormous. It weighs around 6 tons. It carries a 1-ton warhead, which is a huge warhead. Apparently an adaptation of a warhead of an actual bomb, a Soviet era fab bomb. And it uses an AI-25 engine, an engine very, very familiar to me, by the way. It was developed in Zaporozhye back in the 1960s. And it was a very successful small turbofan engine. And perhaps its most famous application is in the Czech N39 Albatross trainer, though it has been used in other applications since then. Now, I doubt that the Zaporozhye factory is producing many more of these engines at the present time. It is regularly attacked by the Russians, after all, but there's probably quite a lot of these engines lying around, including in Ukraine itself. There's probably stockpiles of them. And of course, there are stockpiles of them, no doubt, in the Czech Republic, where the L39 continues to be built, though I don't believe it uses this engine any longer. So anyway, we're talking about a turbofan engine from the 1960s. By the standards of the time, quite an advanced turbofan engine, a viable engine to this day, by the way, but still, fairly old technology. And every other part of this missile, which, as I said, is enormous, also appears to be, well, to say it frankly, rather crude. It is relatively slow. It can fly at around, I understand, its cruise speed is around 600 kilometers an hour, which is definitely subsonic. It is very large. It makes no real attempt at being stealthy in any way. Some have compared it with the cruise missiles that the Soviet Union and the United States were each producing in the 1950s. Cruise missiles like the Soviet Styx missile and the American Matador missile of that period. Very big, very heavy, making no pretense at stealth. These were, of course, powerful weapon systems in their day, but they have been long overtaken by the technology that we see now. In fact, the Flamingo, if I can say, does in some respects highlight the contrast between the technological world that Russian industry works in and the technological world that Ukraine, in its current extremely stressed situation, with its factories under continuous attack, has to operate in. The Ukrainians building a cruise missile with apparently a very long range. It can reach, and I accept this, with a turbofan engine and with a missile of this size, probably it could fly all the way into Western Siberia, for example. A big, heavy, non-stealthy missile of this kind. Whereas the Russians are, of course, now into hypersonic missiles. They've just again used Zircon hypersonic cruise missiles to attack targets in Ukraine. I will return to that again. So they have hypersonic missiles. They have stealthy, very stealthy cruise missiles, not just the KH-101, which is launched from the Russian bombers, but the even more stealthy KH-69, which apparently is now mostly launched by Russian Sukhoi 57 stealth fighter jets. And of course, the Russians have other missiles as well. They have the Oreshnik, which is now entering service, also hypersonic, massively powerful missile. It appears to have largely destroyed, or perhaps mostly destroyed, the Yuzhmash factory or factory complex in the city of Dnipro. And of course, the Russians have also just launched an Angara space rocket, very advanced space rocket. It's a space launch carried out from the Vostochny Cosmodrome in eastern Russia, in eastern Siberia. And we're told that it has launched satellites for the Russian Defense Ministry. So these are Russian military satellites. So the Russians, very advanced now in rocketry and at the cutting edge in missile technology. And the Ukrainians, by contrast, compelled by the exigencies of their situation to lash together a large, bulky, slow cruise missile of a kind that belongs to the technological world of the 1950s and 1960s. Now, the Flamingo, the Ukrainians say that they can build 50 of these a month, and in a factory that was not attacked, that might be possible, though I would say that the Russians have the capability to attack factories anywhere in Ukraine, and the Flamingo, even if it could be put together in smaller plants, probably will need some kind of production line. And, well, with the Oreshnik now entering service, any significant factory can be destroyed by the Russians, just as the Yuzhmash factory was. Anyway, perhaps the Ukrainians can produce 50 of these missiles. But I have to say that a missile of this kind is going to be a very easy target for the Russian air defenses. It has some resemblance, as some people have said, to the Strizh missile that the Ukrainians used early on in the war, which was an adaptation of a Soviet-era surveillance drone. It's about the same size and belongs in the same technological universe, that of the 1960s, as this new missile. A few examples of the Strizh did get through when it was first used, but the Russians very quickly worked out how to counter it. They obviously know about the Flamingo missile. They will be ready for it. And I suspect even less advanced Russian air defense systems, like, for example, the SAM-8 and the SAM-6, which I suspect the Russians still have and could probably bring out and back into service to protect their rear areas, would be able to deal with it. My own guess is that the Flamingo was always intended to be the long-range missile that was to complement the Sapsan, the much more advanced ballistic missile that was intended to take out Russian air defenses closer to the front lines. The idea being you punch through the air defenses with the Sapsan, and then you use whatever gaps in the air defense system that creates to launch your Flamingo missile for targets further deeper inside Russia. I may be wrong here, but that's my guess. With the Sapsan missile system, with the whole complex constructed around it, apparently destroyed or at least badly damaged, I doubt that the Flamingo is going to present for the Russians any insuperable challenges. Now, I am going to make a further guess. Judging from the size of the warhead, a ton of high explosives, that the primary target of the Flamingo is Russian industrial systems, factories, big factories, and in particular the Russian energy complex, Russian oil refineries, Russian pipelines, things of that kind, the pumping stations, those sort of things. The Ukrainians have now returned to attacks on the Russian energy system in earnest, and this morning there are reports that they have again attacked the Druzhba pipeline. This is the pipeline that provides oil and gas to countries like Hungary and Slovakia, EU countries that are demanding that the EU take steps to restrain the Ukrainians from launching these kind of attacks. Of course, the EU Commission loathes the governments of Hungary and Slovakia and has privately almost certainly given the green light to the Ukrainians to conduct these kind of attacks. And anyway, I suspect that this is what this is all about. The Ukrainians have convinced themselves that if they can knock out the Russian energy complex or inflict significant damage upon it, that this is going to somehow bring the Russians to heel. It won't, if only because they can't. As I've already said, this is a gigantic, massively dispersed energy industry located across the largest country in the world. The really sensitive parts of it will be heavily defended. And I can't imagine that the Flamingo is really going to make any significant difference or cause it any significant damage. Whatever the Ukrainians might think, whatever the Ukrainians might be telling the Americans and the Europeans, or at least those people in those places who are prepared to listen. So anyway, this is what I think about the Flamingo. This is what I think ultimately about Trump's Truth Social post. Now, there's been an article in Reuters which sets out what the Russian terms supposedly are. And again, it claims to be based on Russian sources. I once again ask the question, what Russian sources would disclose secret information, well, or at least semi-secret information, to a news agency, a British news agency like Reuters? What Russian officials genuinely connected to the Kremlin would be interested in speaking to Reuters? Reuters doesn't, of course, disclose its sources, other than to say that they're Russians. It could be, and I'm making a guess now, that they are the usual Russian businessmen and journalists that you find in Moscow, you find in any big capital city. They all will say and pretend that they're well informed about what Vladimir Putin is talking about. In fact, what they're doing is that they are reading the Russian media and the Western media as well, and they're cobbling together what they read in the media, and they're rehashing this and providing this all to Reuters, and they're telling Reuters that they have this because they have this inside knowledge of what is going on in the Kremlin. I say all of that because what they're saying is essentially the same as what we have been saying on the Duran and what I have been saying on these programs, that the Russians absolutely refuse security guarantees of the kind that the Ukrainians are demanding and which some people in the West want to give them, that they refuse to allow European troops, NATO troops, to be stationed on Ukrainian territory, that they insist that Ukraine should be outside NATO and neutral and non-aligned. Well, again, it's interesting that these people with their secret sources have been able to obtain all of this information and have passed it on to Reuters because, well, you can find all of this information. You don't have to get secret information to obtain it because it's all there. Lavrov has spelled it out in an interview and 2 press conferences that he has given over the last 3 days. And of course, it is all over the Russian media also. And it is no different from every Russian official going back to Putin has been saying ever since Putin spoke to the Russian Foreign Ministry on the 14th of June 2024. Now, Reuters does say that these Russian officials are again repeating the claim that the Russians have said that if the Ukrainians pull out of Donbass, the Russians will agree to a ceasefire along the existing front lines in Zaporozhye and Kherson region and would be prepared to withdraw from Kharkiv and Sumy and Dnipro region as well. So this, of course, again, could be something that these sources have indeed obtained from within the Kremlin. It may be that Peskov or someone like that is providing them with this information. Or it could be, again, that they have been reading all of this in the newspapers, specifically the Western newspapers, and are regurgitating it to Reuters as information that they have obtained from inside the Kremlin. I have to say, that is what it looks like to me. The point is that I think the Russians have made their position crystal clear. There might be some ambiguity about whether the Russians are still insisting on the transfer of the entirety of the 4 regions to themselves. I have seen no actual concrete evidence from any official source in Russia which says that they are not insisting that all of the 4 regions be transferred to themselves. But anyway, let's leave that aside. Maybe the Russians have indicated that if the Ukrainians are prepared to withdraw from Donbass, they might agree to some kind of a freeze or a ceasefire on the existing front lines in other places, and to withdraw from Kharkiv and Sumy region and those places. But there is no evidence that the Russians have retreated on any of the other things about neutrality for Ukraine, about Ukraine being outside NATO, about European peacekeeping forces not being stationed inside Russia, about the rights of Russians inside Ukraine, about all of those other things that the Russians insisted on at the time of the Istanbul negotiations in March and April 2022, and about which Putin insisted on in the negotiation in his speech to the Foreign Ministry on the 14th of June 2024, and about which the Russians have been insisting ever since. So Reuters goes on to say that their Russian contacts have told them that if the Ukrainians are not prepared to concede on all of these points, then the war will go on. The special military operation will go on. And that, of course, means that the special military operation will go on, because over the last couple of days, Zelensky and other Ukrainian officials like Andrei Yermak and Mikhailo Podolyak have said unequivocally that Ukraine is not prepared to concede on any one of these points, on security guarantees, on NATO membership, on the position of the Russian language, on the position of the Russian Orthodox Church, on any of the other things set out in the original Istanbul Agreement and insisted upon the Russians thereafter. So it seems to me that we are now conclusively in a situation where there is no doubt or ambiguity anymore. We are as far from peace as ever, maybe with the important qualification that without a ceasefire, the Ukrainians are going to continue to be pushed back by the Russians. The advantage will shift ever further towards the Russians. The negotiations, presumably, will still take place in Istanbul. The Americans might eventually start putting pressure on the Ukrainians to make more concessions, and we might eventually get to a negotiated outcome that way. But for the moment, for the next few weeks, probably for the next few months, probably for the rest of the year, the war will go on. And that is the reality, and it is the reality perhaps that we all need to accept and understand. Now, that now brings me to the situation on the front lines. And let's talk first, but not about that, but about the Russian drone and missile strike that took place, which I mentioned yesterday. And it was apparently the biggest single drone and missile strike that the Russians have conducted, combined drone and missile strike that the Russians have conducted, certainly since July, and perhaps since the start of the special military operation. It was a huge strike. Hundreds of drones, again, hundreds of Duran drones, the sky filled with them, and importantly, at least 4 hypersonic missiles, 2 Kinzhals, and 2 Zircon cruise missiles launched presumably by the Black Sea Fleet. Maybe these were land-based missiles launched from positions in Crimea. Who's to say? But anyway, attacking targets across Ukraine. And as a number of people have started to notice, the Russians now are increasingly targeting the Ukrainian industrial complex. They're probably going they're going to continue to conduct the Ukrainian energy complex as well. The oil and gas industry in Ukraine, they've been knocking out refineries which used to refine Azeri oil, Azerbaijani oil, but they're also attacking in ever bigger quantities, on an ever bigger scale, targets other factories. I mentioned that part American or wholly owned American electronics factory in Odessa. The Russians, as I said, are very busy, as far as I can tell, dismantling what is left of Ukraine's industrial complex. And this at a time when Ukraine's financial system is again coming under pressure. There's been statements from Ukraine itself about the scale of the Ukrainian budget deficit. The Ukrainians are now saying that they need another $45 billion to cover their costs over the next year. Of course, with every factory that's put out of action, with every plant that's no longer working, tax revenue falls. Ukraine needs to import more goods. The strain on the economic system intensifies. And the economy, the Ukrainian economy, acquires even more of what you might call a Potemkin nature. Not a real economy at all, in the sense of one that's functioning organically, but instead an economy that is based exclusively on inputs, financial inputs from the West. Now, a couple of days ago, I think it was J.D. Vance, or it might have been Marco Rubio, they both made the point that the United States no longer supplies weapons directly to Ukraine. It only supplies weapons to Ukraine that the Europeans pay for, and there are no direct financial transfers from the United States to Ukraine. I suspect that in practice there are. The United States continues to provide funding to the World Bank and to the International Monetary Fund, and they of course continue to provide funding to Ukraine, despite this fact being contrary to their own charters, just to say. But anyway, they do. And of course, this is money that Ukraine uses, and it uses it to keep its economy together and to prosecute the war. But clearly, funding is less than it was in Joe Biden's time, and the flow of weapons to Ukraine from the United States is probably limited to what the Europeans are able to buy. And here we have funding issues in Europe. I was reading most interesting analyses of the financial position of the European states. They continue to deteriorate. In Britain, of course, in a few weeks' time, we're going to see a big increase in British taxes. This is we're being told to prepare for this by the British government. We're told that there is a £50 billion hole in the government finances, which must be filled at least partially in order to prevent a crisis in the global money markets. Germany is borrowing now at an enormous, reckless rate. I read, by the way, a very strange article in the Financial Times, which said that we shouldn't be too worried about the fact that Germany is borrowing on the scale that it is, because capacity constraints within the German industrial economy make it impossible for the German government to spend the amount of money buying weapons and developing its infrastructure that it wants to. In other words, Germany can't produce the weapons that the money is supposed to buy, or the presumably goods, the tractors, the cement, the other things that would be needed to upgrade its infrastructure. I should say that people who write these articles are being incredibly naive. The spending will, of course, continue. All that will happen is that the cost of all of these items, of which there are capacity constraints, will simply grow. If you cannot increase production, but you continue to throw money at the problem, then the costs inevitably are going to rise. The price, rather, is going to rise. I have discussed this many times. It again baffles me that so few people in the West any longer seem to understand how industry and manufacturing and production actually work nowadays. Anyway, the Europeans, in my opinion, are very soon going to run into limits as to how many weapons they can buy, financial limits, as to how many weapons they can buy from the United States. And the United States, for its part, has limits on how many weapons it can afford to sell to the Europeans, because its own production lines are extraordinarily tight. Apparently, it is going to take at least 7 years, for example, for the United States at current production rates to rebuild its arsenals of shells, to bring them back to where they were before the special military operation began. And there are several problems. There are many problems, as we all know, with air defense missiles. And the United States apparently is now spending more money on increasing production of air defense missiles. But the priority customer for those is not Ukraine, it is Israel. And that is where most of these missiles will go to, after, of course, the US military itself. So these are some of the problems that Ukraine faces. Its economy is being hammered by the Russian missile and drone strikes, and there are no ways round that problem. And I've already discussed how a Ukrainian drone and missile offense, we've already had Ukrainian drone and missile offences against the Russians. They cannot really achieve the decisive outcomes that many people expect. The Flamingo missile, whatever it is, does not look like a game changer, any sort of game changer to me, and I don't think anybody believes it is. Now, let's look at the situation on the front lines, because there have been some very dramatic developments over the last few hours. There's been a confirmation from the Russian Defense Ministry that a string of villages have been captured by the Russians over the last 24 hours. And the Russian Defense Ministry says that Russian troops have liberated Sukhetskoye, Pankovka, Vladimirovka, and Rusin Yar. Now, I should say straight away that I have no idea where the village of Pankovka is located. But about the other places that the Russian Defense Ministry is talking about them, I do know. Now, if we first of all begin with the village of Sukhetskoye, that village is located to the northeast of Rodinska. It is between Rodinska and Belitskaya. It is to the east of the main supply road, but its capture obviously means that the Russians are indeed now wedged between Rodinska and Sukhetskoye, as we have probably known for some time, and that puts the Russians in a position where they have effectively cut that supply road. Now that, by the way, we've known for a while. I think this has been established knowledge for at least a week. This supply road now into Pokrovsk is unusable. In a sense, this piece of information is not new. But the information about Vladimirovka and Rusin Yar is. Now, Vladimirovka is a village located immediately to the east of the area where the Russians achieved about 10 days ago their big breakthrough north of Pokrovsk. And there's been a lot of discussion about this breakthrough. The Ukrainians have claimed that they've conducted successful counterattacks in the area of this breakthrough, and that they have stopped the breakthrough in its tracks. And it is undoubtedly the case that they have indeed captured or recaptured the village of Zoloty Kolodyaz in this area. However, I think as the days have passed, it has become increasingly clear that the Ukrainian counterattack in this area has run out of steam, that the Ukrainians have not been able to advance beyond Zoloty Kolodyaz, that the Russians, in other words, have managed to hold on to pretty much all of the positions that they captured over the course of this breakthrough. It does seem as if they have indeed captured Kucherev Yar. I read a Ukrainian report which admitted that Kucherev Yar has not been recaptured by the Ukrainian military, and I read that yesterday. And the Russians continue the fighting in Rodinska, continues, the fighting in Belitskaya apparently continues. And what is now happening, and what this latest information from the Russian Defense Ministry confirms, is that the area, the territory of this breakthrough is now being widened. If you looked at the original breakthrough, as it appeared a week ago, it was basically a narrow funnel that the Russians had, a narrow wedge that the Russians had launched deep into Ukrainian territory, reaching as far north as Zoloty Kolodyaz. The Ukrainians have recaptured Zoloty Kolodyaz. They've cut off the tip. It looks as if the Russians, however, have re-entered another village in the same area of Zoloty Kolodyaz, which is Vysyolie. Lots of uncertainties about that report. But the Russian Defense Ministry says that the Russians have now widened or broadened this area of the breakthrough by capturing Vladimirovka. And Rusin Yar is another village in the same breakthrough area, located somewhat to the east, further to the east. And what this in its totality means is that the Russians now are creating a semicircle round a village called Shakhove, which is located just to the north of Vladimirovka. If the Russians capture Shakhove and the village of Toretske, which is located to the north of Shakhove, and capture other villages in this area as well, then the territory that they are capturing has indeed broadened, and there is a Ukrainian crisis. There is a crisis for the Ukrainians because the Russian wedge will have thickened and will, of course, have become much more defendable. And by the way, just as I'm making this program, I've now seen flash up that Pankove, this other village, which I didn't know where it is located to the southwest of Vladimirovka. It is another village in this same area. It speaks of an accelerating Russian advance, and as I said, a thickening, a widening of this wedge, and in effect of the hole that the Russians have punched through the Ukrainian defences. And this is relevant not just to the battle for Pokrovsk, which continues, by the way. As I said, the Russians are in Rodinske, they are in probably, as Radovka said, they probably west of the road. There's more reports of fighting southwest of Pokrovsk in the Udachny area. The Russians perhaps pushing northwards towards the supply roads, the E50 road there. The Ukrainians claim to have recovered ground in Pokrovsk itself and to have unblocked the E50 road inside Pokrovsk. But I've seen no video footage myself to confirm this. Maybe it exists and maybe others have seen it, but I should say that I personally have not. But then, there's a huge amount of information and maybe I've just missed this information. But anyway, the point is that the fighting in Pokrovsk continues. The widening of the Russian wedge northeast of Pokrovsk speaks of an operational crisis for the Ukrainians in Pokrovsk, but it also speaks of an operational crisis for the Ukrainians in the east, in the town of Konstantinovka to the east, the southernmost town of the Slavyansk Kramatorsk Konstantinovka conurbation. There are some claims that the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back from within Konstantinovka. The Russians broke into Konstantinovka a few days ago, but the Ukrainians say that they've pushed the Russians out again. Possible. Again, I don't know. But the Russians, in the meantime, continue to clear positions around Konstantinovka. The Russian Defense Ministry says that a village called Katerinovka to the south of Konstantinovka, one of the two villages in the Kliban-Bik reservoir area, which the Ukrainians were clearly clinging on to, that Katerinovka has now been cleared. And yesterday, the Russians confirmed that they'd also captured another village in this area called Alexandro Shulgina. So the Russians are broadening the wedge, not just northeast of Pokrovsk, but west of Konstantinovka also. They now hold very strong positions east of Konstantinovka. They've captured Chasov Yar and other positions, and they control villages literally on the outskirts, the eastern outskirts of Konstantinovka itself. They're clearing all the Ukrainian positions south of Konstantinovka. I have to say this, we are not that far from the point, especially once Pokrovsk falls, when Konstantinovka is going to be encircled. If Pokrovsk does fall, when Pokrovsk does fall, I don't see anything to prevent the Russians advancing further north and cutting all the supply roads into Konstantinovka, the supply roads leading into Konstantinovka from the north, from Kramatorsk. And to repeat again, if Pokrovsk, Konstantinovka both fall, that is the end, ultimately, of Ukrainian defenses in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. They can be outflanked from the south, even as pressure appears to be now steadily building against them from the north. Now, I say from the north, the Russian Defense Ministry has also now confirmed that the village of ODYSEE, northeast of Liman, close to Slavyansk in other words, has now been captured by the Russians. The Russians appear to have now completed the clearing of the Serebyanka forest near the village, near the town of Siversk. They've of course already captured the village of Serebyanka. There is another forest which adjoins the Serebyanka forest, which is the Kremenaya forest. The Russians seem to have mostly captured that forest as well. This is information we're getting from DS, Deep State, the Ukrainian mapping project. They show this territory in the grey zone, but I've since come to realize that what Deep State sometimes shows as the grey zone is often Russian-controlled territory. And alarmingly for the Ukrainians, Deep State is also showing a Russian advance south from the area of the Kremenaya forest towards the south, towards the village, in the area, in the territory of the village of Dronivka. It's beginning to look as if Dronivka itself is soon going to become a target. In which case, if Dronivka were to fall, and with the Russians also now very close to the village of Yampol, it seems to me that before long, Siversk itself is going to be surrounded or taken into a cauldron. And again, to repeat this, one could see all of these events, all this developing. I wonder how long it's going to be before the Ukrainians realize that Siversk itself is undefendable and that they may have to retreat from it. Now, there was a very disturbing report. I have to say I got this from a Russian Telegram channel, so it may be untrue. But there are lots of reports of Russian advances in the Zaporozhye area, and that the Russians are gradually tightening their noose round a town called Orekhov in the Zaporozhye area. They're gradually advancing both at the south and west and east of Orekhov. This is a complicated battle, and I'm not going to discuss it in this program. But there's a report which says that apparently the Ukrainian command has told the Ukrainian troops who are defending Orekhov and the nearby village of Malaya Tokmachka that they are not going to be given permission to retreat. Even if they are cut off, they must go on holding out to the very most bitter end, to the last man, because the fall of Orekhov in particular would open the way for a Russian advance on Zaporozhye city, and supposedly the first steps to try to organize some kind of defense of Zaporozhye city are now being made. I have to say this again, these kind of orders alarm and astonish me. To repeat again, I am not absolutely sure that they have indeed been given by the Ukrainians, because I'm getting this from a Russian source. But it would be consistent with Zelensky's and Syrsky's operational style. They will surely know that if there is a crisis in Zaporozhye, if the city of Zaporozhye were to fall, it'd be the biggest city that the Russians would have captured in Ukraine until now, it would put the Russians in the center of the Dnieper, and it would mean a crisis that would be existential for Ukraine. But even allowing for that, telling men to hold out to the last man does seem to me to be orders of a savagery that I cannot frankly begin to comprehend. And I wonder whether the same is going to happen to this isolated garrison in Siversk. I say isolated because it has been looking increasingly isolated for some time now. The same, incidentally, is true about the garrison in Kupiansk. There's clearly been intense fighting going on inside Kupiansk for some time. There are reports that the Russians have now broken into the industrial area of Kupiansk, which is located, by the way, on the east bank of the Oskol River. Apparently, 2 Ukrainian tanks have been destroyed there, one a Leopard 2, just saying, and pictures of it have appeared. Again, I would have thought that it would make logical sense for the Ukrainians to pull back from Kupiansk and perhaps to consolidate in somewhere like ETHEREUM, for example, or even Slavyansk itself. But no, the orders that have come down is that they must hold on to Kupiansk, even if they're all destroyed in the process. I can imagine that the same orders have been given to the troops who are defending Pokrovsk and to the troops who are defending Konstantinovka. It gives the fighting this grim, attritional character. But the losses that this approach causes are going to be horrendous. And, well, we've already seen that by Ukraine's own admissions, their losses are now catastrophic, and they're not able to hold out in many places because shortages of infantry are creating increasing gaps in the front lines. I ought to quickly say that about a week ago, an article appeared, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal, in the American media anyway, which criticized the Ukrainians for taking a Soviet-style approach to the war, saying that since General Zaluzhny had been sacked, the Ukrainians never retreated, even from undefendable positions. It gave vivid accounts of how Ukrainian officers would bully their personnel across long-distance radio and phones and messages to stand and fight in the positions that they had taken. Now, this is very, very far from the Western-style tactics that the West had tried to teach the Ukrainians, and that the Ukrainians were simply reverting to Soviet type and were copying the Russians. This is absurd. This is completely and entirely wrong. The Ukrainian army, I doubt that there are any officers in the Ukrainian army now holding any senior positions, except perhaps General Syrski, who have any background in the old Soviet army. Most of them will have been purged long ago. All Ukrainian officers, or all the most important ones, must surely have been trained or retrained by the Western militaries over the 30 years since Ukraine achieved, more than 30 years since Ukraine achieved independence. If we're talking about Syrski, it's important to say that he never achieved any high rank within the Soviet army either. He obtained training as an infantry officer from the Soviet military, but most of his career has been in the Ukrainian military, obtaining training from the Ukrainian staffs and schools, which of course have been reorganized by Western and have received inputs from Western officers. Moreover, if we're talking about stand and fight orders, they were as much a characteristic of the Ukrainian approach in Zaluzhny's time as they are in Syrski's time. And if we go to the Russians, they're repeatedly shown that they are prepared to withdraw from undefendable positions. They withdrew from Kharkiv region and from Kherson region in 2022. The Russians have never at any point in the war adopted these nihilistic tactics that the Ukrainians have, even though obviously the Russian army is much more deeply connected to the Soviet traditions than the Ukrainians are. As I said, this is an absurd claim. It again shows the degree to which most of what we read about the war in the Western media is refracted through a deeply distorted Western lens. Just saying. Anyway, that brings me now to two last topics that I wanted to finish this program today with. Firstly, following up what I said about drones, the way in which the Russians are successfully scaled up their drone industry and the enormous proficiencies of the Rubicon group, and the contrast with the Ukrainian inability to do that, which was highlighted by that article by someone who knows the Ukrainian drone industry from the inside, that article which appeared in the journal War on the Rocks. I should say that today the Russian news agency TASS is carrying an article which it attributes to Russian security services, which says that the Russians have successfully blinded the Ukrainians, that they have knocked out pretty much all of Ukraine's surveillance drones, that they've developed technologies and means to destroy the Ukrainian surveillance drones. And that this now means that on the battle lines, the Ukrainians no longer have the eyes in the sky that they had before. They are now entirely dependent on intelligence that they are provided by the United States, primarily by the United States through its satellite systems and that kind of thing. They no longer have the battlefield intelligence advantage that they used to have earlier in the war. Now, I've discussed in previous programs information that I've received about the Rubicon Group, this extraordinary hybrid military civilian tech company that now runs Russia's developing battlefield drone program, that operates many of the drones that function on the battle lines. By the way, I should clarify that Russian military units, frontline military units, also have their own drone operators. So it's not as if the Russian brigades don't have their drone operators, but the Rubicon unit or Rubicon organization operates in a kind of more centralized way so that it can be redeployed from one part of the battlefield to another, or at least it can send units, if you like, components of itself from one part of the battlefield to another in order to conduct drone operations. Apparently, a significant drone operation conducted by the Rubicon group is now being conducted north of Pokrovsk and is stifling the Ukrainian supply lines there. Just to say that one of the things that I also have learnt about the Rubicon group is that it has also been working very hard on developing countermeasures to drones, and that it has provided an enormous amount of training to Russian infantry as to how to avoid drones and to things that can be done to avoid being attacked by drones, special cloaking uniforms, cloaks and things of that kind, but also how Ukrainian FPV drones, in fact FPV drones generally, Ukrainian FPV drones have to operate close to the surface. That means that in order to receive signals, there has to be a bigger surveillance drone operating higher in the sky. The way to blind the FPV drones is to knock out the surveillance drone, and Russian troops have been given instructions on how to do that. And one of the ways that it's done is through using shotguns, apparently, but there are other more sophisticated ways as well. And I suspect this partly explains what the security services are telling TASS about how Ukrainian drones are now being blinded and are being rendered, in effect, ineffective. So that's from the Russian security services. Now, I ought to say that I had a huge amount of information about the Ukrainian casualty losses and about the hack. I've had information from a party which claims to be, I believe is in fact, in contact with at least one of the hacking groups that was involved in this hack or alleged hack of the Ukrainian General Staff. This source tells me that this is a real hacking group, but accepts that there is a real possibility that it might be controlled by Russian military intelligence. I'm getting a lot more information both about this hack itself and about the data it's provided, and I'm now comparing it with other data that I've also received, including some earlier data I received about 2 weeks ago. And well, I'll be providing my conclusions about this later in this in future programs. But this anyway is where I'm going to stop today's video. Lots going on, but to repeat again, the war continues and is going to continue for some time. There will be no Putin-Zelensky summit meeting anytime soon. We might be seeing a Ukrainian missile offensive against Russia at some point over the next couple of days or weeks. But the reality is that on the battle lines, the Russians continue to break through. And frankly, expectations that the Ukrainians will be able to hold on to Donbass for very long, I'm sure, are going to be disappointed. Well, that's me for today. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.